Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bill Baker with Firestorm, and we're pleased that you've been able to join us for this RenWeb webinar. This is the first in the 2016 series of the Crisis Coach webinars, and today we're talking about crisis or consequence management. Our presenter today is going to be Jim Satterfield, who is the president of Firestorm. We'd like to have you as our friend. Firestorm Solutions is our Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter, Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind that our presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product that we discuss must be read in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. In addition, this information should not be considered legal advice or legal opinion. Firestorm is delighted to have RenWeb as the underwriter and host of this webinar series. You can go to firestorm.com and you can watch previous webinars in the series, and you can register for future webinars. We hold these once a month. Today, Crisis or Consequence Management by Jim Satterfield.
Let me jump in, Bill, if I can. I don't think that Shannon has had a chance to join us yet, or she's out helping a client at the moment to share together. We're very excited about the relationship with RenWeb, and I think this is the start of the third or maybe even now the fourth year that we've done the Crisis Coach webinar series with them. It's certainly an opportunity for you and your school to look at what standards and best practices are and what you need to do to be able to manage events that occur in your school. The RenWeb platform gives you certain tools in terms of notification capabilities, a central repository for your information, as we look at some of the various elements that are in conjunction with it. So I think there's a lot to consider that's going on associated with it. I do want to share one thing that's coming up that you might want to put on your calendar now for you and your school and share it with the sister schools in your area. On February the 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, Firestorm is going to conduct a virtual test exercise on active shooter. It'll be a chance for you to take your crisis team, put them around the table, and experience what it's like to make a decision in going through one of those events. You may remember that last month we did a virtual exercise on cyber breach. We obviously, with everything we're seeing in the news, the emphasis on active shooter and the concerns that parents have are quite significant in that area. So this would give you a chance to see what it's like to make those decisions. It will deal with events leading up to it, the actual event, and then the consequence management thereafter. So that's February the 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern. It will be a 2-hour exercise, so you want to plan a little bit more time on your calendar to do that. And either you can put your team around a table in a conference room or a classroom, and then you can talk about the escalations and understand what you know at each level along the way. So I think it'll be a good opportunity for you to grow. I look forward to having you join us in that particular event. Now, unless you are in Florida or Tennessee or California, I know that if you're on the phone call today, you didn't win the $1.6 billion last night. I didn't either, so I was hoping that one of you had won so that I could be at least invited to the party. Obviously, there are events that occur, and one of the things that we want to think about as we talk about today are the risk around us, and then when a crisis starts, it's a turning point, and it will change the direction of events as we move forward in a crisis. As we think about those things, there are things that you can identify early that in many cases you can either mitigate or prevent that crisis from occurring. It's a lot easier to manage those situations if the gun, in fact, never comes to school. We've done surveys regularly, and this is a result from one of the surveys we did last year, and it asked the question, do you currently use external intelligence to identify potential threats. And you'll notice that less than a third of the schools that we surveyed were in fact doing that. And one of the things that I want you to learn about today is what are the intelligence opportunities that you can have and put in place so that you can identify these events before they escalate into violence, before you have the concerns around a crisis. And so we're going to share those thoughts today and give you some new tools that you can take things that you already have in place and start to build your own intelligence network. Now, when we look back, and most people are in disaster denial, they feel it's not going to happen to them, it won't be so bad, or they're smarter than everyone else and they can deal with it. But today we're in an environment where everything is foreseeable, and tomorrow anyone may be found accountable. If you turn the clock back and you look at some of the events that have occurred, we see a theme that those that are in charge, those that own the building, own the facility, and have that responsibility will be held accountable even if they're not responsible for the act. A terrorism event that happened in the 1990s, they found the terrorists guilty in a criminal trial, but there was a civil trial for damages, and the jury awarded 2/3 of the liability to the building owner as opposed to the terrorist that was there with only 1/3 of the liability. But more importantly, in a school environment, no one wants to have to pick up the phone and call a parent and say that their child won't be coming home from school that day. So as we think about it, today we're in an environment where everything is foreseeable. The knowledge and information that there's a potential for these events to start to happen in your school is at your fingertips, and that's really what we're going to try to highlight today. As we start to think about intelligence, it's how do you know what it is you don't know? Now, there are 3 buckets out there. We know what we know. That's that green bucket that's in the center of the screen. And then there's what you know you don't know. There's a bunch of those things that fall into that blue category. But the largest category here that we're looking at is what you don't know you don't know. And that's what our goal is when we're thinking about creating an intelligence network for you, to give you some specific insights into what you can do to reduce the risk and exposures there. How do you take what you've currently done and add this intelligence element so that as you see these things starting to happen, you can recognize them and take the appropriate action. Now, as part of the Crisis Coach webinar series that we've been doing, we've talked about predict, plan, perform. Today, we're going to really zero in on the predict phase, understanding the vulnerabilities, understanding what their impacts are, how we would monitor them, what would trigger us to activate our plans. And so in coming out of this today, we're going to build on the foundation that you've already done with your hazard impact analysis or your vulnerability threat assessment for your school, and looking at each of those areas. We're going to add some additional tools into that to help you better understand the activation and processing of your plans. And we want you to know this before now. You don't want to find out that there's an active shooter in your school. You want to find out the day before that there's a behavior of concern that you can intervene so that that gun never comes to school. That's really where we're putting our focus, and I think you'll find that you'll get the most return on your investment by looking at it and thinking about how do we create this type of an intelligence network that we know before now. All of us have bosses, and if they're aware of a problem and you're not, and they come to you, that's an uncomfortable position to be in. So we want to put you in that point and start to identify. Now, when you thought about you're looking at the hazards or vulnerabilities or risks that you face, one of the tools is an item called a hazard impact matrix, where you list all the risks and threats and the probability that they would occur and the types of impacts and the speed of onset and the length and duration. It's a way to organize your thoughts. And there's a false trap that comes in here where you think, well, I thought of all the hazards, and you'll find invariably that you haven't, that there are other things that can occur. But that's a good founding point for you to look at. All of you have some level of plans. You've thought about them. You've created an emergency plan within your school. You've got perhaps some others, but you started from a risk. If you're a school in Texas, you might be thinking about tornadoes. You might be thinking about winter storms someplace else, or flooding, or earthquakes if you're a school in California today that's with us. So as we think about all of those, we want you to start from there and then add some other elements to it. One of the ones to think about is business crisis risk. We're responded in the last year to several schools that had some fraud that occurred, that there were issues that were happening in the business side of their house that created a risk for that school. But whether it's a natural event or a violence event, there are warning signs associated with each risk. And we're going to give you a tool to start to document those so that you can look at, oh, for this, here's the warning sign, here's the indicator that would tell us, here's the trigger that we should pursue. And I'm going to give you a new way to think about these in terms of guarded, elevated, or severe. Now, we've used those terms with you in the past when we've talked about things like communicable illness, and you're seeing an escalation and you're at a guarded level, and then you raise to an elevated, and then finally at a severe, so that it would include the responses that you would take as well as the probability that those would occur. We also use those same terms and have used them in past with you in talking about behaviors of concern: guarded, elevated, and severe. But those three terms really apply across all of the hazards and risks and vulnerabilities that we face. And so let's think about those today as we start to explore what we would do with those areas. Now, one way to begin the thought process is to look at the 5 common failures in disasters and crises. And these are true for businesses as well as schools. The largest common failure in a disaster or crisis is the failure to control critical supply chains. Second is the failure to train employees for working at home. 70% of people at work don't know what they're supposed to do in a disaster or crisis, and 95% don't have a plan at home. And that's an opportunity to help in each of these areas, because family trumps job as we carry forward. Looking at identify and monitor all threats and risks is the third most common failure in a disaster or crisis. And today we're really going to be looking at that word monitor. That's going to be the one that will make the biggest difference. Doesn't do you much good if you've identified a bunch of risks, but you're not monitoring to see if they're about to occur, if there's a potential for immediacy at this point in time. Fourth is failure to conduct exercises and update your plans. Fifth is failure to have a crisis communications plan and predetermined message maps. What are you going to tell parents? What are you going to tell students? When are you going to tell them in each of those individual areas? So as we focus on this third one today, you're going to use the predict, plan, perform methodology to organize your plans in response. You'll identify and involve the groups that you see there, conduct the exercises, and then finally establish how we're going to monitor and how we're going to communicate. And when every time you see the word monitor, I want you to think about intelligence. Just like a general needs to understand where's the enemy, what's the size of their force, which direction are they moving. There is an intelligence network needed for you at your school to recognize all of these risk exposures so that you can properly activate your plans. So if we think about it, how do you predict something? You look at all these words that are behind our young people today: hazing, sexual harassment, child pornography, communicable illness, active shooter, suicide. All of those come with warning signs and indicators that we can intervene earlier in the process before it has risen to a level of active violence. And how do we predict that? We build an intelligence network. And you're going to be in charge of doing that within your school, and then once you see those things happening, activating your response or your plans associated with it. We can't build a wall around our school and lock out all of the problems externally. Those problems come through our doors every day, and we need to find a way to recognize them and deal with them early. So can you really identify and predict a crisis? The answer is yes, overwhelmingly yes, because we have to look at the warning signs. Many times when we do an analysis or a hot wash after a crisis, and I was just reviewing a series of those today, you'll see the warning signs that went unheeded, and you'll go, well, gee, Jim, nobody would have ever missed that. The answer is yes, they would, because they weren't looking for them. There wasn't a central repository to gather that information together so that it's presented to the team to make a decision. So once you've learned the indicators, then you can start to address those before the crisis. That's where the value is. It's in the value of identifying the indicators and seeing them pre-crisis so you can see it before it happens. We don't want to wait until that gun physically comes into the school to activate our plans for violence associated with it or any of the other exposures that are happening along the way. Now I want to go back and pick up that business crisis risk area to start to show you how diagnostic models get developed. This is one in looking at it, and that blue box there where it talks about an acute business crisis, those are generally things like natural disasters and active shooters. It's very targeted, extremely urgent. Speed is quality there as we think about it and looking at the impact on your school or your business. But the other three quadrants that are out there are widely missed by most organizations and practically every school. They're difficult, chronic, or severe. And it's where there weren't controls, there was some disruption, it started to continue, there wasn't a formal process, it then became systemic, there weren't metrics to deal with it, there could have been other elements associated with it, and then it escalates all the way up to severe, where you've got parents intervening on why aren't we dealing with this issue, or maybe the people that regulate you, or there's a reporting requirement that you missed that was a potential impact on a child. So as we think about this, we need to build an intelligence network that starts to let us know that these things are beginning to occur. So I want to introduce a formula to you, and look at the top of the slide. It says information plus insight is equal to intelligence. You're the insight. There's a lot of information around you. It's out there, but you've got to find it, provide your insight into it, and now you're converting it into actionable intelligence. And so we're going to go further and further into that process for the rest of our webinar to help you lay out how you create this intelligence network. And we want to know before now. We don't want to wait until the bad thing happens, until the crisis occurs to act. So urgency is a key driver here, and urgency is a function of a crisis. If you got suddenly a PA announcement that there's an active shooter on the premise, there's no choice that you're going to have to act at this point. But our goal is to try to get you earlier in that process. Compliance is another urgency factor. You have to, if you're aware of a potential threat to a child, you're going to have to report it to the authorities. It could be domestic violence, it could be other factors. Fear of loss, brand and reputation. You don't want to be the school that's known as this is the place where that occurred. Cost savings, in many cases there's an opportunity to spend less and save some money there, which certainly most school budgets would be glad to be able to do that. And then finally, is there an opportunity revenue? Is there something that we can do that would help us in the school area? So when we think about these risks, whether they're business crisis or otherwise, it's structural, it's operational, and functional. We're looking at something that's happened by the way that we're organized, or there's a breakdown that's missed in understanding it. If we can do that, they will have impact on us if we can't get them eliminated. Impact on our people, on our profitability, on our brand and reputation, and they'll define who our school is, and we can't afford to accept that. So our goal here with creating an intelligence network is to identify these impending risks before they occur, before they escalate up to a crisis. Now, information and intelligence needs vary depending upon where you are in the cycle. Now, when we think about the 5 stages of a crisis, there are 5 that come to mind: pre-action, onset, impact assessment, response and recovery, and post. Now, at pre-action, what do? Well, it's things like you're attending a webinar today, or you might be attending that active shooter exercise on February the 18th. There's an opportunity to train your people, get your supplies in place, make sure that you have the monitoring for your intelligence network starting to feed in. All of those are intelligence and communications things related to what I'm sorry, you got my whole music there with another call that came in, so I apologize. Hopefully we're back, and the 5 stages that we're talking about, and may repeat that Bill had pointed out we had a problem: pre-action, onset, impact assessment, crisis response and recovery, and post. The knowledge that you need, the intelligence, the activation, information, has to be identified in advance so that you would get it properly at each point. At onset, we're focused on life and health safety issues. After that, we move to the impact assessment. How many students were injured or hurt? Do we have deaths? How significant is it? Did the tornado affect the security structurally of our buildings? And then we could declare a crisis, activate our crisis plan, and then move into our recovery plans to become operational, and then post-analyzing it. So where do we start in this process? How does it come together to know what intelligence we need and how we reach out to that? And the answer is that we start with a vulnerability analysis. You've already done this. You know what risk that you have around your location, what risk you've seen in the past, and we start to put those together. We're looking at the impact that that could have versus the certainty that it would occur. Those items that are low to medium impact, those are normal operations. You have somebody call up and they're not going to be able to come to school today, so you find a teacher to cover that class. Those are normal operational issues, and that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about are those risks and threats that are significant enough that they could have a significant impact upon our school, and clearly those that have a high probability and along with a high impact in that danger quadrant, we're going to need to focus our plans. And so just as you're planning for all those things, we have to begin to design an intelligence network to let us know that they're about to occur. That's what we're talking about today, and that's where we're coming in. And that'll make the difference of whether this escalates all the way to a crisis and then ultimately has severe consequences for our school. So let me introduce a couple of new terms to you and then give you a tool to help you organize your thought process here. Now, if you think about it, these are risk derivatives. So you don't see some things, for example, fraud. You never see fraud. You see evidence of fraud that's occurring. And so what we want to do is to say, if we've got the risk, and look at that table, that's the blue table at the bottom of the slide, you'd list all those risks and threats that you've identified. Then you'd start to say, what's a warning sign of that particular risk that I need to be aware of? Now, I listed some sample risk derivatives. Attendance. If suddenly 20 or 30% of our students are out, it could mean that we have a communicable illness plan problem within our school area. Maybe it's an outbreak of the flu. Maybe it's something more severe. Every year we have even childhood diseases that cause significant absences in our school as the illness gets passed from one student to another. It could also be an indicator that maybe there was a threat at the school that some children knew about, and so they're not coming to school today because of that happening. A behavior of concern. You've had a student who's been doing extremely well and suddenly isn't doing well. Maybe their attendance isn't coming together as you would like, and they're missing classes, or you see bruises that appear that maybe there's some violence that's occurring at home. These behaviors of concern are something to become aware of, and it's an indicator that something else is going on. So if you look at the risk, the warning signs, and the indicators, that will lead us to some conclusions. Now, when people have issues and problems that are there, they talk about it, and where do people talk today? They talk on social media. So understanding what's going on makes a significant difference. We set up a geofence around a warehouse for a business, and we were able to identify that there was a problem the employee had with his supervisor, and it appeared to be racial. And as you further read into the postings that were going on, it seemed to have escalated to a point, and finally the last posting of the day was, there's only one way to resolve that, and that's with a gun. I'm bringing a gun to work tomorrow. Well, in that scenario, wouldn't you want to know about it today instead of tomorrow when the gun comes to school? And the answer is yes. And so setting up tools to monitor social media, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today, could well be an indicator for you to be able to take action So that information comes to you, your insight, then leads it into intelligence. We're setting up monitoring for a franchisor with 800 locations, their restaurants, and looking at the neighborhood around each one of their restaurants. We've set up a geofence with a 1-mile radius to find out what's happening in those areas. So if there were drug deals going on or violence or demonstrations, they would want to know it for their restaurants. Wouldn't you want to know the same thing for your school? And then as we think about observing those indicators, what's the trigger? How bad does it have to be before we step into action? The graph there in the upper right-hand corner of your slide takes those areas and divides them into guarded, elevated, and severe. Now, the blue line across it is kind of a normal lower level, and so most of the time the risks are at a low level, but we still have plans and awareness, and that's where we do the monitoring. Once on that rose-colored line you start to see the threat escalate, then our indicators will tell us, and we start to reach a level that we need to take action. It becomes elevated. And then finally, if it starts to peak and is severe, it's highly probable, or it's beginning to occur, this is an opportunity for you to intervene and activate your plans. I'd like you to think about every risk that you have that you've already identified, write them down, fill in the warning signs, the indicators, what's the tool in which you're going to measure it, what's the trigger that's going to cause you to carry forward, how do I know if it's guarded, elevated, or severe? Now, it's not enough just to do this, then we have to convert this intelligence into action. That's where your plans start to come in play. So awareness is played as follows here. This is the standard protocol that's used in schools today. Evacuate, lock down, lock out, and shelter in place. So you see the term of art, the condition for action, the directive that's given, and then what's the action that you expect the organizations to do. So if you've created an intelligence network that lets you know that these things are starting to happen, you know which one of these actions to take and what the information that you're going to communicate about it is and the anticipated action that you look at. It goes beyond just this. Here's on the left an activation matrix for a business. They've divided things into minor events, incidents, or business crisis, and you see if that minor event is just business as usual. They'll let their normal operations take. If it's escalated up to an incident and they were concerned about data security, facility, human, operational, delivery services, power, social media, workplace violence, then they had descriptors of if you do this, this is the activation. They further had some concerns about notification of executive leadership, and you see they had some descriptors under facility. If there was only damage to the facility, it was no, but if there was serious damage and they couldn't use the facility, yes, you had to notify senior management. And then finally under category 2, the business crisis, those immediately went there. But we're not limited to schools and businesses. Look at the church service activation matrix to your right. Here this church was concerned about an imminent weather event, imminent violence outside of the church, imminent violence inside the church but not in the sanctuary during the Sunday services, imminent physical threat in the building, collapse, fire, bomb, medical emergency, imminent violence in the sanctuary. So here you've got the action, the message, the usher responsibilities, and what the crisis management team is doing. This is an opportunity to take the intelligence that you've got, lead it into a single page so that everybody is on the same page at the same time, knowing in fact what they need to do. So the cyber breach activation matrix here for a business is another format. They were concerned about impacts on information assets and technology, brand and reputation, and user, and they divided it into 3 levels from normal all the way up to high probability. So think guarded, elevated, and severe as they come together with the descriptors and who's going to take action. So what we're doing is taking information, converting it into intelligence, and then moving it into action and communications. So from this background, how is that done? Well, we listen and we look. When we talk about listening, that's looking at what the conversation that's going on. People know when they know they talk. And that could be hearing things in schools, it could be the anonymous reporting, it could be the monitoring of social media as we've been discussing. And so that gives us an idea of what's happening. We look at streams phrases and words. It provides us a general situational awareness that there's a threat or a risk and exposure that's starting to occur. Now, once we've identified an event or a person of interest, we then look at that person in greater depth. And we have to identify what we want to do associated with that. And we can use geocoding to look at particular locations, or we can do the research over the internet to carry it forward. A virtual investigation, if you will. And these become extremely important for us as we're dealing with anything that could ultimately be behavioral. Let me step you through a couple of quick examples of how listening and look and then leading it through. And I'll take an example that we saw in a business, and then we'll apply it to a school situation as we're moving forward. If you saw this report, and this occurred last August that we saw for a client where we were looking at what was going on, we saw this posting, "I'm going to kill somebody at work today." Well, if you had a posting that said, "I'm going to kill someone today at school," would you be concerned? The answer is, yeah, we'd be concerned. We want to find out what we can do to help and intervene in this particular area. Further in doing some of the research, we looked at this, and knowing I have to go to work in the morning makes me want to kill myself. Well, if you had a student that was contemplating suicide, is that something that you would want to immediately act on? And I know everybody on our call and meeting today would immediately say, yes, that is something of concern. We do want to become involved in that. So are they just frustrated? Is this real? Is it make-believe? What's going on? And so you have to look at all of the intelligence, all the information that's coming out there, and then you have to have a process by which to deal with it. So it's not enough just to have dealt with it. How does this fit into your program? Do you have a program that's pre-identified in your school to deal with behaviors of concern? So it's assigned to someone to act. In this case, we escalated this to Susie Laughlin to take a look at to see what was happening. And so a well-designed monitoring program has a built-in escalation flow. So if we created this intelligence and this trigger is hit, you've got to go back to those event activation matrices that I showed you earlier, or have a system that says, when this occurs, this person will take this action and move forward. So as you look at your workflow, as you look at those individual items, what are you expecting? And then you have to have the feedback loop coming back to you to be able to carry it forward here. Karen was the person responsible. There was a behavior of concern. She's got to look into it to provide you with further information. So you've got to have the escalation flow built into your monitoring to make sure that these elements come together. That's going to make the difference as it happens. Because when we think about all these things, when minutes matter, seconds count. If you can intervene before these other things escalate to a crisis, it's going to give you the ability to control the outcomes that are occurring. Now, it can be pretty confusing with all these things happening at the same time, but that's why you need to know what you need to know, what your teachers need to know, how the reports would carry forward, who's responsible for making those decisions and taking action and testing them. By the way, this will be another benefit of the virtual exercise next month for you to participate in and see how those decisions come together. This is an example of a company, and there was an IT manager. The city turned an investigation of him over to the authorities, and look, it led into a terrorist charge. The events in San Bernardino, the shootings at the community college out in Oregon last year, those types of events are occurring all around us. There are specific concerns, and every piece of information you're seeing here was available over the internet if you had an intelligence system, if you were monitoring and looking for it to know. And if you knew that this was one of your students, would you want to know this before it escalates and before it becomes this event that we're calling 911 to get the response from the police department? So there's a lot of things for us to consider as we think about our school and knowing about what's happening. Creating an intelligence network so that you're empowered with that information is really where our focus is to associate. When we think about next steps, would you want to know what's going to happen tomorrow? The answer is yeah, I think I would. And I don't think I could afford not to know. And so as you made those lists, as we showed you earlier, of all the risks and threats that you've already identified, let's start by figuring out what the warning signs are for each of those risks. Do that with your team. We're at the start of the year. This is a great time for a New Year's resolution. Get your crisis team or your emergency team, whatever you call them in your school. Sit down and say, okay, for this risk, what's a warning sign? What's a risk derivative? What's an indicator that we can look and see? Who's going to be watching for that? How are they going to do it? What's the trigger at which we move to activate our plan? How do we know it's at a background level, guarded? How do we know it's moved up to elevated? How do we know it's at a severe point? If you start to define those now, the intelligence network that you create will then empower your plans to become much more actionable at each step along the way. So what else could you do? You could participate if you choose in the active shooter exercise on February the 18th. Again, that's going to be at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central. It's a chance to have your team go through and see what it's like in an active shooter event to make the types of decisions that you have to. You can begin to align your plans to standards and best practices. Here's a quick tool that you can do. Take your plan and give it to your newest teacher and ask them to review it, and then give them a situation and see if they know how to do whatever it is you want them to do. Most plans talk about what, they don't talk about how. And so one of the things that you can put into place now is to give that opportunity for them to experience it, for them to begin to understand it and be able to carry it forward. Now, designing an intelligence network, start with your hazard impact analysis. Start with your vulnerability list, your threats, your concerns. You can look at everything you've already listed in your emergency plan, if that's a start. What happens geographically where you're located. Write all those down in a column. Then by each one, talk about the warning sign, talk about the indicator, talk about the trigger. If there's a monitoring involved, what's the tool that you would use to be able to do that? Who's responsible for it? And when you finish that matrix, you're going to have a pretty good understanding of how you're managing the intelligence that's available to you within your school. Creating an access tool, I would think over the next 2 years, you want to move to the point where your plans are on your smartphones, that they're available in the hands of the teacher so that they're not having to look for a binder on the shelf, that they can pull that document out off their phone and know immediately what you want them to do. It gives you another communications channel to make sure those elements are there. Or schedule some training just like this webinar series sponsored by RenWeb, so that you get a chance to learn about what's going on and where you need to carry forward in each of these individual areas. Your current RenWeb system provides you with tools already in it. There's a notification capability. There's a central repository capability that you could put documents in so that one person's observation about a student could be matched with another person's observation about that student, so you could start to see, is there an escalation? Is there a concern now in a behavioral basis that you need to take action on? It is going to take oversight. It's going to take your insight to take these disparate topics, bringing them together to know we need to activate our plan and to make it available. You can download a brief from today's webinar by going to firestorm.com. You can, or around what we were talking about today. You can also view prior webinars that we've done over the last several years in this Crisis Coach webinar series. There will also be sessions at this summer's RenWeb conference around this to give you more of an insight into that opportunity. And if you come to the conference, you can bring your plan and we can talk about helping you evaluate where you are relative to standards and best practices. Also, because you're a RenWeb school, if you would like us to review your plan to standards and best practices, that can be done at no cost. We have an assessment that's done. It's a $2,500 assessment, and because this webinar series is underwritten by RenWeb, it's available to you at no cost. And so that's another opportunity to begin to understand. Our thanks to RenWeb for all that they're doing to help make your job easier every day and to make your school more effective and to help the students in your classes. Look at the systems that are there. I'm meeting with the RenWeb team the first of next month as we're talking about some other activities that I think you're going to find of value. If you have questions today, you can go on the firestorm.com website. There's a contact form there. You can fill that out, and we'll be back in touch with you. You can also send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or you can call us at 800-321-2219. We're here to help. We will assign a Firestorm principal to answer your questions and work with you in your school. I want to stop and thank you for everything that you do every day and the mission that you have in providing help to our young people. The support that you provide in your school is a tremendous asset to everyone. The chance to learn and to grow and to move into maturity, the moral guidance, the insights that you share, and the support that you provide our young people is absolutely critical. Thank you for all that you do. This is an opportunity now for us to think about the risks and hazards and vulnerabilities that our young people face, that our school is exposed to. There's a chance for you to build an intelligence network to make sure that you're understanding that these events are starting to build and expand. This is a chance for you to make a difference within your school so that crisis doesn't come as a surprise, but it's part of a program that you put in place to manage those events. Sorry you didn't win the lottery yesterday. I didn't either. But, you know, I don't know. I would love to have had the challenge of trying to figure out what to do with $1.6 billion. 3 people did, Florida, Tennessee, and California. If you're not that person, we're going to have to work on making our schools better tomorrow, just as we worked on it yesterday. The differential here is you can make a difference. The risk and threats can be managed. You can prevent many of these crises by having an intelligence network. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great day. That concludes our webinar for today. I look forward to speaking to you next month in another Crisis Coach webinar, as well as in the virtual active shooter exercise on February the 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern, and it's at no cost to you. Have a great day, everyone. Goodbye.